Dinner that night was supposed to be quiet, the kind where everyone pretends nothing has been simmering for years until one careless sentence finally cracks the surface. I am Haley Moore, an architect living in Raleigh, North Carolina. And for most of my life, I have been measured against my sister in ways that made even breathing around my parents feel like a competition I never entered. That particular evening, Tessa was at the table talking excitedly about her newest contract, a modest interior project that sounded more like a student showcase than a real breakthrough. Yet every word out of her mouth drew applause from both Mom and Dad. They leaned forward asking about colors, materials, her vision. I sat silent, letting their voices blend into the hum of the kitchen light. Then Mom smiled across the table and said it. Dad repeated it, his tone proud but cutting. "We wish you were even a fraction of your sister." I placed my fork down, pushed my chair back slowly, every movement deliberate. "Then she'll be thrilled to know she's about to start paying rent for this house." For a moment, no one breathed. Tessa coughed, water spilling down her wrist. Mom's face went pale. Dad looked like he had forgotten how to speak. That was the exact second the ground beneath our family began to shift, even if they didn't realize it yet. Have you ever been compared to someone you love as if your worth depended on their shadow? Tell me in the comments. I want to know if you've ever felt the same. 5 years earlier, family dinners were more predictable than the weather. I had just started building my career as an architect in Raleigh, balancing design deadlines with the quiet hope that one day my parents would see me for who I was rather than who I wasn't. My mother Ruth loved planning every weekend meal like a small holiday. My father Warren took pride in keeping the same traditions that had defined our household for years. My sister Tessa worked as an interior designer and had an endless list of stories about her clients and projects. Every Saturday evening, we gathered around the same oak dining table. Mom would ask Tessa about her latest project. Dad would lean in impressed. Words like ambitious, talented, and gifted floated around so often they became part of the wallpaper. Whenever I mentioned my own work, designing affordable housing plans or staying late at the firm, Mom's eyes drifted to the kitchen clock, and Dad would hum politely before steering the conversation back to Tessa. It wasn't cruel, just habitual. They admired what they could see. Architecture to them was too abstract to be impressive. I started missing dinners. Work became my excuse, but part of me knew it was self-preservation. Each missed meal was a quiet act of rebellion disguised as responsibility. Over time, the distance between us became a kind of safety. Mom would occasionally call, but her tone always carried subtle reminders. Tessa's really moving forward. You could learn something from her drive. I learned not to react. I told her I was happy for Tessa, and maybe part of me meant it. Dad was the quieter one, but his silence spoke just as loudly. I realized approval in our family was less about success and more about performance, how loudly it could be celebrated. I built my own routine. A small apartment downtown filled with sketches and models, long hours, and the satisfaction of creating something tangible. I stopped expecting the balance to change. It was easier to build walls made of work than to keep standing in rooms where I was never really seen. Then, late one evening, my phone buzzed nonstop. Mom's voice shook in a way I had never heard before. She said Dad had made a bad investment. The bank was threatening to take the house. Her words came out breathless and trembling. At that time, I had been saving for a small apartment of my own. Years of careful budgeting had finally brought me close to a down payment. Listening to her panic, that plan felt distant and selfish. I didn't hesitate. Within an hour, I transferred most of my savings to her account. She cried with relief, promising Dad would repay me once everything stabilized. The next morning, Dad called to thank me. He admitted he had trusted the wrong partner and lost nearly everything in a property deal that went nowhere. He assured me it was temporary. I wanted to believe him. Weeks passed. The sight of my empty savings account quietly haunted me. The calls from home became more frequent. At first, just check-ins. Then one evening, Mom called again, her voice softer this time. The bank needed an additional payment to postpone foreclosure. Just a little more, she whispered. I could hear Dad in the background insisting this was the last hurdle. I transferred another large sum that night. After that, I stopped counting how much I had given. What mattered was that the house stayed in their name. A few months later, I received a call from the bank itself. They asked if I would act as guarantor to prevent repossession. When I mentioned it to Mom, she said gently, "It's just paperwork, Haley. You're the responsible one. We need your signature so they take us seriously." Her words pressed on the part of me that still wanted her approval. Against my better judgment, I went to the branch and signed the papers. The banker congratulated me for helping preserve your family's home. I smiled weakly, not yet understanding that the ink on that form would tie me to their choices more tightly than I could imagine. I convinced myself that sacrifice was love, that someday they would recover and we would all look back and laugh at the difficult season we had survived together. I didn't yet understand that what I saw as loyalty was to them simply expected. Several months later, I agreed to come home for dinner. Mom said it would mean a lot. I arrived in the early evening carrying a small bottle of wine as a peace offering. At the dining table, Tessa was already telling a story about her latest project, a modest corporate office redesign. But the way Mom leaned forward and Dad beamed, you would have thought she had just been named Architect of the Century. They praised her creativity, her determination, her business sense. I smiled and cut my food in silence, telling myself I could survive the evening by fading into the background. Then Mom turned toward me, her tone shifting into something sharp yet casual. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" The words stung, not because they were new, but because they were said as if the answer was something everyone already knew but me. Then Dad added his voice, calm but firm, "We wish you were even a fraction of your sister." I placed my fork down. My hand was steady despite the pulse in my ears. Years of biting my tongue had left me with nothing but quiet resentment that now demanded to be spoken. Then she'll be thrilled to know she's about to start paying rent for this house. The sentence cut through the air like breaking glass. Tessa choked on her drink, coughing as water spilled onto her plate. Mom's face drained of color. Dad stared at me, his confidence crumbling into silence. I pushed my chair back slowly. The scraping sound filled the room louder than any argument could. I stood, straightened my jacket, and looked at them one last time. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I turned and walked out. My steps echoed in the hallway, steady and deliberate. The front door clicked shut behind me. I didn't wait to find out what came after. If I turned back, even for a second, I would be pulled into the same cycle of apologies and explanations that had defined our family for years. As I drove away, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. For the first time, I wasn't the quiet daughter keeping peace for everyone else. I had finally said what needed to be said. In the weeks that followed, no one called, and I didn't either. The silence was thick, not angry, just hollow. I started by calling the bank. I asked to remove my name from the guarantor documents. It took 3 separate meetings, 2 legal consultations, and an uncomfortable signature to sever that tie. When the final confirmation arrived in the mail, I placed the papers neatly in a folder labeled closed. It was a strange kind of freedom, uneasy but real. At work, I threw myself into projects with a focus I hadn't felt in years. My firm had just landed a large urban development contract, and I was assigned to lead one of the design teams. The more I worked, the more the weight of my family's shadow lifted. For the first time, my success didn't need to be validated by anyone else. One afternoon, I ran into Lee Collins at a cafe near the office. A former colleague who had left the firm 2 years earlier, and one of the few people who had always understood me beyond small talk. When I hesitated talking about my family, she looked at me and said quietly, "You don't owe them your peace just because they're your parents. If they never respected you, they never will. Stop setting yourself on fire to keep them warm." Her words stayed with me longer than I expected. That night, I replayed them over and over until they became less like advice and more like truth. Weeks turned into months. I stopped sending money home. The first time I skipped transferring the usual amount, my hands shook as if defying an unspoken rule, but nothing happened. No calls. No messages, no confrontation. The silence was strangely liberating. I began spending weekends hiking, cooking for myself, traveling short distances. Simple things that used to feel like indulgences. Life was quieter, but it finally belonged to me. Then one morning, a coworker texted me, "Are you okay? I saw something online." My stomach dropped. I opened my phone and found a post circulating in local community groups from Tessa's account. The caption read, "Some people forget where they come from." When your own sister abandons your parents after they saved her countless times, you start to question what family even means. Attached was a smiling photo of our parents in front of the house I had once fought to save. I didn't comment. I didn't defend myself. The urge to explain had died somewhere between exhaustion and acceptance. Those who knew me didn't need proof. Those who didn't would never believe it anyway. I closed the app and went back to work. 2 months later, the messages started pouring in. At first short and polite. "We're struggling a bit this month. Can you help just once?" Then more direct. "You know your father's health isn't great, right?" Then, when I didn't respond, the tone shifted entirely. "I can't believe how cold you've become. After everything we did for you, this is how you repay us." I stared at the screen for a long time until the words stopped meaning anything. Mom switched from texts to emails. Long paragraphs filled with guilt, accusation, and disappointment. Each line designed to drag me back into the role I had escaped. I didn't reply. Then came the day Dad showed up at my office. The receptionist buzzed me, her voice hesitant. "There's a man here asking for you, says he's your father." When I stepped into the lobby, he was already pacing. His first words weren't a greeting. "Do you even understand what you're doing to this family?" He said it loud enough for nearby employees to glance over. I asked him to lower his voice. He didn't. "You've become selfish, Haley. Completely ungrateful. We raised you better than this." The heat of humiliation crept up my neck. Before I could respond, he turned away and muttered, "You'll regret this when you have no one left." After he left, whispers started circulating through the office. I noticed glances exchanged near the break room, hushed tones in the hallway. The pity was worse than the judgment. The following morning, Tessa posted again. "Some people only care about themselves no matter how much family has done for them." No name, but it didn't need one. The photo attached was of our parents on the porch looking tired and sad. Within hours, it had dozens of comments praising her for being the good daughter. Colleagues I barely knew began looking at me differently. At lunch, Lee found me sitting alone in the courtyard. She had seen the post. "You don't deserve this," she said softly. "They're trying to make you feel guilty for saving yourself." I managed a faint smile and said, "No, this time I'll handle it." That evening, after everyone left the office, I stayed behind. I opened my file drawer and pulled out the folder labeled property documents. I spread the papers across the desk. The deed, the mortgage statements, the notarized contracts. Every single document carried my name alone. I had paid the taxes. I had signed the contracts. I had kept that house from foreclosure when no one else lifted a finger. For the first time in months, anger replaced hurt. Not the kind that burned uncontrollably, but the kind that clarified everything. They had taken my silence as weakness and my kindness as obligation. The humiliation, the whispers, the online mockery, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was truth, and I finally held it in my hands. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the folder, and locked it away. The decision forming inside me wasn't impulsive. It was calm, deliberate. The kind that comes only after you have been quiet for too long. If they wanted to play this in public, then perhaps the truth belonged there too.